going to go ahead and get started because Dallas Salisbury is here and he's got a lot to say. He's president and CEO of the Employee Benefit Research Institute, or EBRI, which those of you who are in this space are probably very familiar with. He's also, I believe, the founder of EBRI. And that was quite some time ago, 1978. But before that, he did lots of other things. He's been looking at retirement issues from a variety of perspectives for a very long time. He's also very passionate about saving. I know he practices what he preaches. And again, when it comes to retirement issues, he's pretty much done everything. He is a member of the SEC's Investor Advisory Committee. He's on the Board of Advisors to the Comptroller General, the Board of Directors of the FINRA Investor Education Foundation. He's won lots of awards, and he is going to talk to us about retirement in the private sector. And he knows about all of it, but this is the specialty, so looking forward to it. Dallas, thanks for being back. I'll also say he's really a friend of the foundation. He's been here at every retirement program since I started and several before that, I'm sure. So really appreciate your coming back.
Thank you. Good to be here. Before my mother passed away at 93 years and 11 months, she had said to me many times, because every now and then I'd be in Seattle doing a presentation, and mother and father would attend. And over the years, she would always say, they really should have had me introduce you, because what they chose to emphasize simply underlines how old you are. And if you're that old, then what does it say about me? It is always a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure for us to meet one of our primary objectives from day one, which is to provide data, numbers to the media and various other individuals in the realms of academia and public policy and all. We're a little bit unique as organizations in town go because we were started up as a independent with a absolute legal prohibition on our ever taking any position for or against any public policy issue or any particular design, whatever. And that's because we were created by firms that had already had lots of lobbying organizations, and what business and labor, who always disagreed about everything and never belonged to the same lobbying organizations, felt that there was a need for was for third-party data that they and others could agree was valid on. Initially, it was all about pure retirement programs, and by about year 3, that extended to starting to do health insurance data and other issues. And with a focus that has always remained U.S.-centric, in the sense that we frequently work with press and public policy organizations and others in other parts of the world, but it is always to help them understand the U.S. systems and the U.S. programs and the U.S. data. It is never to talk to the U.S. to help them understand what other nations are doing. And that's just a practical thing of resources. There's only so spread thin that anybody ever wants to make themselves. And I think I'm just going to use the magic button up here, if I can momentarily move to that mode. Yeah. And I actually have been at this, as my mother's emphasis on my age would underline, for 40 years. Having joined the Justice Department in 1974 and went to work for the then Deputy Attorney General. And ironically, the first meeting that I was asked to attend on my second day of work was in the Deputy Attorney General's conference room. There were individuals there from a number of government agencies, And the topic was this pending legislation before Congress, the Employee Retirement Income Security Act of 1974. And my next move after the Justice Department was actually, upon enactment of ERISA, going to the Labor Department, and then from the Labor Department to the Pension Benefit Guarantee Corporation, before leaving government just short of 5-year vesting, which tells you something about how old I was and what I wasn't thinking about that I should have been thinking about. So if I go back to the federal government at some point and work for another 4 months and 1 day, then I will have eligibility for a defined benefit pension annuity payment and for retiree medical protection. And having done the mathematics on how much that might be worth if I live based on family genetics to what my physician says every year, the only bad news I can give you is you're probably here for about 105 years. So stay healthy, and just, you need to keep working, because if you're going to do a normal fake period of retirement, you really shouldn't retire until about 80. And I now am still involved on the PBGC advisory board, having been appointed once by the first President Bush and this time around by President Obama. So I am what you might describe as narrow of focus. That definitionally says I've spent 40 years living in Washington, D.C. My mother never forgave me for leaving the other Washington, the good one, as she always said. And always focusing on employer benefits, which what I really mean by that is public or private benefit programs, including Medicare, Social Security, etc., that essentially make use of payroll deduction as the method of collecting the money that they use to pay benefits. And in that sense, I've always viewed Social Security as an employee benefit program, Medicare, etc., whereas Medicaid is not funded that way, so I've never thought of Medicaid as an employee benefit program. But workers' compensation is, unemployment compensation is, disability protection, etc., etc. So it's a broad venue. As I mentioned, we are in the description business. We are not in the normative business. We have painfully come to know that any data can be viewed and interpreted many different ways dependent upon the question somebody is trying to answer, or the bias that they have, or, as Mr. Levinson underlined, what product they're trying to sell, and they're trying to use the data to wrap around it. But then, being that I'm in Washington, D.C., I have to carefully note product has to be deemed any organization that is advocating and trying to sell anything. So if the person that has written a study, or if the member of Congress that is talking, or wherever it happens to be, if you know their position on the issue and what they say the solution should be, and now with the wonders of the internet, you frequently can go determine whether they'd taken that position before the study was even began, or before they had begun writing the particular analysis that they are releasing that day that just happens to say that you should adopt their recommendation. So whether it be the recommender of a mutual fund, of an insurance policy, of an annuity, of a particular piece of legislation, of the good or bad that you should see in some program or some system, I would agree with the essence of what I understand Mr. Levinson said. Anybody that is advocating anything, assume that you better look 2 or 3 layers below to see what the numbers really are made up of and what they might have. This happens in public policy just as readily as it happens in things that come out from companies selling product. Frankly, it happens at AARP and some of the things that they do which are selling product, whether that's their Medicaid supplemental programs, or it is some of their policy positions where you clearly can look through the studies and see that it has, by choice of words, been parsed. In the data that's been selected, because the study is being done after they've already determined the position, or they've done 26 studies over 32 years that have supported that same position. Now, this all becomes even more difficult than it did for many, many years because of people's attention span. And this one was emailed to me the other day by Nevin Adams, who's our Director of Communications. And Nevin had spent 25 years in banking, administering defined benefit and defined contribution plans, and then moved on to journalism and was editor-in-chief at Plan Sponsor magazine for 12 years before moving down from New Jersey to join us. And this is the message that he's constantly trying to give to my researchers. And you will see from some of the data that I present that he's not always totally successful. And his emphasis point is that what we keep getting, I don't care if it's from somebody on the Hill, somebody in the administration, a reporter, most any place, frankly from business people, students, you name it. Well, but can't you just give me one number? Can't you just give me one replacement rate? Can't you tell me how much should people have saved as a multiple of their income or the multiple of what they want to spend in retirement? My editor only let me put in one number. Now, in our space, that ends up meaning that almost everything one reads, Levinson's definition of coverage, or the modeling that you go to, the calculators on the AARP website and many other for-profit entities, many other nonprofits, is you will find a common element. The magic replacement rate is 80%. The magic multiple of what you can pull out, the withdrawal percentage, is 4% per year. The average in defined contribution plans and retirement savings, the average account is, pick your number, but the most recent one that keeps getting repeated is $100,000. I want a number to represent the wealth status of the American working and retired population. The magic number this week is $12,000. Now, what is right or wrong about those numbers? And with all of them, why might you pick one of them or not another one? But more importantly, what do they all have in common? Every single one of them, if ever used, is totally and completely misleading to anyone that is reading it and attempting to figure out what they should do. Whether it be a policymaker, a business person, or one of us. Levinson's comment that was referenced. You'll never actually run out of money because you'll always have Social Security. Reference point. My father passed away just short of 94. Mom was 91. For the last 3 years of my mother's life, she had one source of income. For the first time in that life, it was a modest Social Security check. Because my father, taking my mother's advice, when he retired, had not selected a joint and survivor annuity. He instead had chosen the single life annuity. And some years later, my brother, his wife, was given the same advice, and he was given the same advice when he was retiring from the University of Washington, a public pension provider. In both cases, there wasn't a single sum option. I dare say that if either one of them had had it, they would have taken the single sum, not the life annuity. And my brother and sister-in-law got quite upset with me when I said, but if you do that, you're just being stupid. And I couldn't understand why they took it personally. And my sister-in-law looked at me and she said, I have always told your brother you're impossible. And they ended up, we did some math for them, they asked some questions. She found out that her little theory, as she said to me, based on what? On common perceptions. If you have a defined benefit retirement plan, you'll be in great shape. Universal statement. What doesn't get talked about if you use a number for a defined benefit plan? A typical defined benefit plan provides 60% income replacement. There was a time when that was true. But for whom? Individuals working for the Fortune 50 or one of the 10 largest state or federal pension plans in the United States. And for whom wasn't it true? Tens of millions of other people in other plans. So she looked at me authoritatively. She was well educated. She had a long career herself. She'd worked, they both worked while they raised their 4 daughters. And she said, I make twice as much money as your husband. She glared at him. He is retiring after only 25 years. Well, she didn't say because he spent 14 years in the Navy. And I've been working 37, or will have been when I retire. How can my pension not be twice what his will be? Or more. So why would I need his? So we went through the math. His pension was going to be $3,600 a month. Not bad. She checked with personnel. She found out that her pension was going to be $900 a month. 37 years, twice as much money, consistently twice as much money. She was a nurse. My brother was a very competent mechanic, but mechanics don't make what supervisory nurses make. And so what did they do? Out of 16 retirees in that session, every one of them had a spouse with them. 15 took no joint and survivor annuity, and 1 took a joint and survivor annuity. My brother died 18 months later. They never know. My sister-in-law has no idea what happened in the couples of the other 15. But it's only to make 2 points. One, choices matter, obviously. And number 2, go to Levinson's point. If financial advisors or anybody else are saying you'll be better off, you'll always be better off with a single sum distribution or the highest benefit amount, what are they selling? The financial advisors that say the benefit amount, what they then will sell you is a life insurance policy that they say as long as you keep it, when the primary beneficiary of the pension dies, the life insurance will make up for not having taken the joint and survivor annuity. What they won't tell you is that there's a lapse rate on those policies of over 85%, because after a certain number of years of a fixed pension, even with Social Security increases, people can't afford to maintain the life insurance. So it might be short-term smart, but to Levinson's point, trying to sell something. So our principal warning always is try to avoid single numbers, and when people want you to use a single number, at least make sure you ask all the questions to understand why that number may need context and may be wrong, or most likely is. So which of these numbers is right on the other coverage that is there? How many people have an employment-based retirement plan other than Social Security? Every one of these numbers is right, because every one of these numbers is based on using a different population. And so if you go look at testimony from the Plan Sponsor Council of America, which is an advocacy organization for these programs, you'll find 82% legitimately and directly attributable to the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Census Bureau. They publish it. But 47 is equally accurate. The difference is it is all civilian workers in the economy over the age of 21, whereas the 82% is full-time, full-year workers who stay long enough to become eligible to participate in a plan. And depending on what you're trying to evaluate, both numbers may make sense. The 28 drops you down to the age of 16. And some years the census drops it to 14. So if, on the other hand, you're an advocate who is attempting to advocate that what we need is either the elimination of voluntary programs and the creation of a mandate, individual mandated savings a la Australia, or employer mandate of some form, they will use the 28% because it also can be attributed to census and BLS. Therefore, it is accurate. But it basically, again, skews the point. Because what's the key question we should always ask about whatever we're doing or what programs accomplish or don't accomplish? What's their objective? Why do they exist? Why does your employer have it? Or why do you have it? Or why are you doing it? Or why does public policy have it? So you end up with all of this being in that context where there's more to have to consider. How have definitions under the law changed? ERISA's changed definitions of coverage several times. It's changed the definition of vesting several times. It's changed funding requirements regularly. And with each one of these changes, given numbers may end up meaning totally different things over time, because what somebody has been told they must do to abide by the law has changed in each of those windows. But if the individuals don't pay much attention to the details, that can lead to problems. So if you look at the definition change, defined contribution plans were never considered pensions before ERISA. They were not in the pension definition of public policy. ERISA defined defined contribution plans as pension plans. What did that instantly do? That said that instead of a pension plan under federal law being only those plans that pay a life income annuity, pensions now instantly also include plans that pay single sum distributions. And suddenly the universe, yet how many articles do I write or read? Both. Where pension ends up being substituted for defined benefit, and it gets assumed, or the writer says, a defined contribution plan is not a pension plan. Where essentially the people who implement ERISA, employers, you name it, lawyers on the Hill, staff on the Hill, to them it's all one legislative morass. What did the vesting change do? Vesting basically took plans. I was doing a presentation a few weeks ago and I sat and listened to the panel after me. The guy that runs the Ohio State retirement system was describing their defined benefit and defined contribution pension plans. And he said, we make no apology for having 10-year vesting because our defined benefit plan has only one purpose: to provide meaningful benefits to those who stay with us for a full career. We do 10 because politically we have to on vesting. So what does that mean? If you were promising something that only 10% of the people you ever hired were going to get, Congress comes in, changes the law. Now 25% are going to get it, but you want to spend the same amount of money. What's it mean you do over time? You cut the design of the pension plan so that the total amount of money you have to contribute and goes out the door stays the same. There are clearly lots of millions of people that get something who would have previously gotten nothing, and an equal number of millions or more that get far less who would have gotten far more. And as you make these public policy changes, you sort of, just based on simple economics and decision making, you make it harder for individuals with a particular type of program to get delivery of what gets defined as adequate retirement income. What was the largest employer in the United States that did the first major significant cut in their defined benefit plan post-ERISA? Anyone want to guess?
Yeah.
Federal government of the United States. Began the effort in 1983, went into effect for everyone hired after 1987. The defined benefit plan, which had produced a 2.4% per year of service accrual, was replaced with a plan of 1.1%. A rather significant percentage decrease in the generosity of the defined benefit plan. There was a monetary savings, not as much as it would have been, because they put in a defined contribution plan as a supplement. It was only after they did that that the first major American for-profit employer did something similar, which was in 1984, the end of 1984, for effect 1/1/85, which was Bank of America, which put in the so-called first cash balance or hybrid or individual account defined benefit plan. And the system, between ERISA's legislative changes, therefore the economic equation changes, and then through, you all have heard and written about behavioral finance. And my wife has always said to me, look, that's just psychology. It may be important, but it's just psychology. She's telling me that to remind me that her mother taught psychology for 30 years and her degree is in psychology. And she's been aware of all these behavioral implications from Skinner et al. For decades, and she can't understand why suddenly when economists want to talk about it, it becomes cool. Because she always thought psychology was cool, still does. So the dynamic is what in behavioral finance gets called framing. And what did the federal government, the Congress of the United States, with the signature pen of the White House, of Ronald Reagan, what did they frame in the early 80s? It is okay behavior to cut the heck out of your defined benefit pension plan and to create a substantial defined contribution pension plan that will pay single sum distributions, along with the DB plan that will pay an annuity. And that is, by the definition of the Congress and the White House, the appropriate combination for employers to offer to their employees. Because framing isn't what somebody verbally says to you. Framing is the picture. Framing is the setup that you then interpret. So no one takes annuities anymore in a defined benefit plan because they all select lump sum distributions. What is the frame of that? It's in my brother's retirement class. Well, I can't give you advice. I can't tell you exactly what you should do. All I can tell you is I've been doing these programs for 3 years and no one has ever taken a joint and survivor annuity. My brother and sister-in-law were literally sort of dissed as they had to verbally make their decision known, which was the way this, and it was, how can even the course leader say, I know I'm not supposed to make recommendations, but how can you do that? So to emphasize vis-a-vis some of these debates, it still is voluntary whether to have these things. And you can read down the list. ERISA is a voluntary structure in all regards. And it essentially is within that voluntary structure, and the economist theory of all of this is deferred compensation anyway. Is if an employer was funding 3.8% of pay, which for years was what the percentage of payroll cost of even a generous defined benefit pension plan was, and you're going to have the world redefined for you, and you still want to spend 3.8% of pay, then you reshuffle the designs and you reshuffle the chairs. That's what Congress did. If you haven't read about it, you might find it interesting to track down the report issued recently by the Pentagon on a Pentagon Commission's conclusions related to the modification of the federal military pension plan, which would take individuals on the defined benefit plan who are entitled to a benefit after 20 years of service and 30 years of service and start paying single sum distributions on the value of the annuity between the age you take it and the age of 65. So they'll split it into two values. They'll lump sum you the early value, and then from 65 on, they'll start paying you a reduced annuity. And when you read the write-up and you read some of the interviews, what is the comment made? It is what those being recruited into the military expect based on what they see happening in the rest of the world. So bring it back to the objective. What is the objective? The objective of the federal government was to make employees happier. Employees didn't and don't generally place much value on a defined benefit pension plan, period, stop, till they pass a survey age of about 50. Then they start to become sort of interested. By 55 to 57, interest has gone up a fair amount. Defined contribution plans, love them early. The young, that's all I want. Just, I want to see money growing in an account. I'm leaving the military after 30 years of service. I'm 50 years old. The pension won't be enough to live on anyway. I want to go into business. Give me a lump sum. That's what their surveys of the military are telling them. So again, forget good, bad, what's up, what's down. It's just the context changes constantly. But some of the advocates never change their context. And so with some of the advocates, if you ask, well, what do you think of this frame? They'll tell you, oh, I've opposed every one of those changes. They were all bad ideas. Or someone else would say, I've loved them all, they just haven't gone far enough. They haven't introduced total choice, which is what someone else will say they advocate. And so how they look at the data and look at the frame will change dramatically. Now, many individuals are looking at these things now with Teresa Gardahucci up at NYU, advocacy of state-based mandatory schemes, a federal mandatory scheme to replace a lot of things. The dynamic really is just looking at the Affordable Care Act and the repeal effort and the absence of popularity. We're not for or against repeal or creation of any of these things, but in context, it just says the politics of what lies ahead is probably off a little bit. Employers and workers, different ability to pay, one size does not fit all. Flexibility encourages sponsorship and participation. you put that into the frame of the design of the Affordable Care Act, and it really recognized those things on the health side. One size doesn't fit all. You need choices, you need alternative subsidies, et cetera, et cetera. So where's the system been? We constantly hear about change. The blue line on the bottom is number of defined benefit pension plans in the private sector. The black line is combined DB and DC. So we've seen decline, but we've also, through the mid-'80s, we saw dramatic growth in the total number of plans. We saw total growth in the total number of individuals who were gaining accruals under these plans or account balances under these plans. We were seeing a shift. You can see the numbers of defined benefit active participants. These are, all those other numbers include total participants. So you're adding together those that are already in pay status, they've retired, you're adding people who have left an employer but are owed something later on. And this takes you down. You can see that those in DB plans, active participants, has been a steady decline path, which is continuing. But most importantly, this goes to what I said, public policy definitively changes the equation. As you see in 1974, 20% of those that were participating in a retirement program at work actually had a right to ever get anything. ERISA comes in, and ERISA takes vesting, which in some plans was 30 years, some was 20, some was 15. It says you have to use 10 max. ERISA is then subsequently amended, and the response is you have to use 5. And if you want a safe harbor 401k plan, you've got for some amount of the money, use full and immediate, in other pieces, 3 year. What do you instantly do because of labor force turnover? You suddenly, through that legal change, move the number of people in the system that will actually get something up to where you see it by 1998. Almost equal to the total number of participants. Now the body's moving through, it's a changing population. But in essence, the move of fast vesting defined contribution dramatically increased the number of Americans who will get something out of the retirement system. That combination of redesign added together with legal change. As a result, pension contributions have dramatically gone up in all sectors. Payments being dispersed to retirees and those pre-retirement have been going up throughout that entire period. Now, why is this important? Only because when somebody says we want a single characterization, are things getting better or worse? Or somebody says to you in the press release, there's a crisis, things are really bad. You really, frankly, have to ask the same question Levinson said. What are they selling? Why do they want to call it a crisis? Or why don't they want to call it a crisis? Is there a reason? Is there something they're advocating and trying to sell? Now, one of the interesting things is up until recently, the public pension debate had sort of been different than the debate taking place in the private sector. And that was until about a week ago when a new study came out of the Urban Institute, funded by the Pew Trust, through a public center funded by the Arnold Foundation. Now, like Levinson, follow the money. The Arnold Foundation's a super rich guy down in Texas who's spreading lots of money around the country aimed at reforming Social Security away and reforming the pension systems from DB to DC. Look at all the old work from Urban, funded by others, like the Ford Foundation, Ford tended to love DB plans. And you end up with this type of conclusion, which I point out only because it is so fundamentally different as a conclusion than anything I'd ever read from the public policy groups at the Urban Institute. And they put out their first studies on public pension plans when I was involved with a group there in 1978, 9, 80, 81, 82, 83. So you end up with changing of context. The public debate, you can expect to now change framing of message among some of the, end quotes, reliable constituencies. And basically it goes back, these same charts have always been true of public and private defined benefit versus other plans. As the guy from Ohio said, a defined benefit plan's purpose was always to provide a meaningful benefit to the long service worker. If you've been with us for 30 years, you'll get enough money. If you haven't, you won't. But how does frequently the coverage, end quotes, get covered? It always puts defined benefit plans as if everybody was going to get that 60% or that 40% or that whatever. It says this was the formula and the plan will pay this amount. And that yellow area shows you essentially that the people who really won with DB plans, you see up until 23 years of service, you'd be better off with defined contribution. What proportion of the U.S. labor force spends at any point in their working careers more than 25 years with one employer? It's a pretty small number. Enter cash balance plans, the curves change a little, the yellow curves, and the defined contribution. And why did employers beginning in 84 go to cash balance? Because they were trying to mimic a defined contribution plan. Meaning they were trying to say we're going to equally benefit everyone. We're no longer going to primarily design for long service workers. Why are we not going to do that? Because Congress has passed a whole bunch of laws that say we want everyone treated the same. And we want them treated the same with short vesting, but voluntary. More people, shorter vesting, voluntary. What's the budgeter say? Here's how much we're spending in total. Put that dollar figure here. How do we have to change the menu in order to meet the law and spend the same amount of money? And design change becomes given. So you're now beginning to see public sector governments go to cash balance for some of the same reasons. Set aside again, right, wrong, plus, minus. It's just, there is explanation and rationale behind all of these. And this goes to this question of 25 years or more and tenure. Is the lines, it's more just to emphasize the relative flatness of them. And the fact that median job tenure, even among those 55 to 64, is only 10 years. 8 years for 45 to 54, 5 years for 35 to 44, and 3.2 years for the very young. And to emphasize government data, how long has this been true? Well, in general, the entire post-World War II period. So the old notion, well, gold watch, pension, full career, the notion that used to be sort of common mythology, how many people ever actually did that? Not a whole lot. Women, the same thing. The numbers have gone up because of more women in the labor force. But if you look on the far side, you're dealing with, for the last decades, the female tenure patterns and male tenure patterns being almost identical. And then go to this issue of long tenure. And if you go to the oldest, 60 to 64 public sector, you do see that you get roughly a quarter that do in fact spend enough time with the entity to hit that point you saw on the urban curve, a totally accurate curve, to get better from the defined benefit than from defined contribution. But what's that tell you? 75% do better under defined contribution. It just depends on what you're trying to accomplish. All the numbers are right, but you've got to put them in context. Go to the private sector for 60 to 64. You're down here, you do get up to 18%. But again, that's still more than 80% that do better in a defined contribution program than they would in a defined benefit program, based on traditional designs. And would do better in a cash balance plan than a final pay defined benefit plan. So again, who is it designed to assist? And then put that in context of debates over working longer. Debates over can you. You know, my mom and dad both lived to almost 94. In hindsight, Dad didn't need to retire at 65, but he'd had so many healthcare crises over his life and had been close to death in the intensive care unit 4 different times. He was absolutely convinced that he'd have a life that was not very long. Why, therefore, he let my mother convince him not to take the JNS is beyond me in hindsight. But I did spend every day that I talked to them for years and years telling Mom that the most important thing she could do every day was keep Dad alive one more day. And every now and then, they'd been married by that time they ended up married 69 years when he died. And that was after dating for 9 years.
Oh my
First date, she says their first date was, she was 13 and he was 16. He said to the day he died, he never knew it had been a date. But, but it's, why do people leave? And we can't underline, or shouldn't fail to underline, the degree to which health status, the nature of your job, the nature of what you do, is a lot of people do have to retire earlier than they want to. So we try to avoid the single number stuff. It can frequently, as I said, be misleading. The 80% may or may not be meaningful. For me, I've saved aggressively, is we've ended up, because of the way we save and the fact that we've never spent particularly, if we have about a 40% replacement rate beyond Social Security, we'll be fine. Other people, my brother, who's disabled, he needs a replacement rate of about 129% right now, just to cover very basic expenses, and that's even being in subsidized housing at the age of 67. So where you sit makes huge differences, and 80% to him is a crisis. 80% to me would have me not knowing what to do with the money, because I never spent that way at any other point. And those types of things help for many people. The single number context is, I was reading a paper from the Bipartisan Policy Center earlier today, and it used the NRI number from Center for Retirement Research, and this 54.7%. And it said who would have might have adequate savings to meet pre-retirement lifestyle post-retirement. It didn't say the 80%, which doesn't always get emphasized, but what else doesn't get emphasized in that model? That it's measuring on one day. It's measuring the day that you hit 65 or some alternative age. It is assuming that you annuitize all of your assets. So everybody's going to immediately do a life income annuity for everything. Why do they do that? So that longevity risk is not a factor. We run numbers that way, we run numbers other way, but that ends up being, for any of us doing this or putting out numbers for reporters, a critical question. What is your assumption on whether or not people try to do it themselves or have a life income annuity? Second example, long-term care protection. Their model added that, end quotes, after some congressional committees suggested they do it. How did they add it? They assume that everybody has a long-term care insurance policy beginning at age 65. How does that take care of it? It gets rid of long-term care risk. Have they actually gotten rid of it? No. Why? Because the market for long-term care protection, right now, group policies is less than 3 million workers in the United States, public and private sector. Total number of policies in force across all ages is now only about 8.8 million. And many of the people with long-term care protection are now in their late 80s, mid-90s. I had dinner the other night with a 96-year-old who was describing to me how glad she was that her husband, the doctor, now deceased, had insisted that they buy long-term care insurance policies in 1985 when they first came on the market. So it's a very broad population, but the market is very tight and it's hard to get. There's only one major carrier still heavily in the market, that's Genworth. So you've got to dig under the conclusion, dig in what it's really saying. The good news is it's attractive to have a number. The problem may be that the number may or may not be accurate. So I think this is really a repeat of Levinson's note. Assume everybody's being honest, but make sure you investigate. And make sure you don't end up in the mythology game. So does one number do it? Or these are just issues, you'll have copies of these, the kinds of questions to ask when reporting a story, when covering in the retirement area, of the types of things that are or not included. And what kind of databases are being used? We are able to do a micro simulation model versus a macro model. Boston College does a macro model. What does that mean is they can't break down with detail because all their cells are far too small. Using the Survey of Consumer Finance gets you about 300 people with 401k plans. And you bottom code it and you top code it. So it's very rough analysis. It's what can be done. Do the numbers reflect and the results reflect what that limited data set does? Yes. We add in individual account information on 24 million defined contribution participants since 1996, and we've now got 22 million individual retirement accounts matched to that data. We've got broad-based data on hundreds of defined benefit plans. So what we're trying to do is have detailed information on a micro model basis so we can actually simulate new people coming into plans. What happens when people take lump sum distributions? What happens with different investment allocations, et cetera, et cetera. And so what do you look at against future years of eligibility? You look at, and we don't use 80% replacement rate. We use BLS data that says everybody has a budget in today's retirement world. Here's what people are actually spending. We do it by 4 income groups. We create an average. It's not perfect, but it's better than a replacement rate because it actually relates to, in my brother's case, how much he actually needs to spend to have a roof over his head and food on his table. And at 100%, yeah, we have a big gap if people have no eligibility. But Social Security still does quite a bit. By the time you get to 20 plus years, you're getting pretty close to 100% at an 80% standard. We think 100% standard of basics would be better, but you still are getting 86% that would be there. Now, what about the long-term care issue? How important is it? It is excruciatingly important. This side, with long-term care, this shows you by quartile with long-term care protection. With long-term care expenses. This is without long-term care. So you end up getting, essentially, for the lucky people that aren't going to need a nursing home, and no one in their family is going to need a nursing home, the current system, defined benefit plus personal savings plus Social Security, et cetera, for those populations is going to do quite well. The Bipartisan Policy Center paper today, they say 37% will end up with some long-term care expenses. So you got 37% of the population, by their number, down here. For the highest income quartile, you're still in pretty good shape. You move down, you move down, you move down. And for the lowest income quartile, what it tells you is that Medicaid is an extraordinarily necessary program. And the reason we started doing this modeling was actually at the request of 3 states. Why did they want the modeling? They were trying to figure out what their long-term obligations were going to be under the Medicaid program back in the late 1990s. So when it comes to numbers, be skeptical. This one always seems to be this way because it is true that when popular wisdom gets internalized on any of these subjects, it's hard to reverse it. Every bit of Levinson's coverage of retirement issues for some segment of the population, because of the cat theory, short attention span, goes in, locks, you move to another subject, something just flashed on that internet page, is undoing it. Moving people to right notions is always more difficult. An example in this town is everybody knows that tax preferences for retirement income programs are, in quotes, upside down. Well, why is that? Well, to the degree it's true, it's because the tax rates are upside down. Because people that make more money pay more taxes. And so what they calculate when they make that statement is how much taxes are being paid. We did the analysis to look at it a slightly different way. We actually did this because we were asked to by the Bacchus' staff on the Finance Committee when he was still chairman. And they said, what if instead of looking at the tax side, you look at how much money is accumulated by income level in these programs? And when you look at how much money is accumulated, you end up, as a proportion of where people are on the income scale, what you end up finding is that, gee, it isn't particularly upside down. It's actually individuals at the, end quotes, lower, less than 100,000, actually relative to income and relative to taxes end up with far more than even the people at the top. Why? Because the law includes caps on what can go into this stuff. So it's not that the other statements are, end quotes, wrong. or that this one is right. The fact is they're both right. They're just telling you very different things, depending on what question you're trying to answer. And so again, per Levinson, why is the statement there? What is being advocated in the context of making the statement? So don't always take the bad news approach. It's the old fire theory, I guess, or man bites dog. But it's something to think about. So where are we relative to that past? ERISA came in. 24 to 25% of those over age 65 had defined benefit pension income. Not quite everyone. Got up to 37% in the early 1990s. Kick in of vesting, kick in of other changes in tenure, and then pretty much stabilized, and is still relatively stable, but in essence is still better than any situation prior to 1989 in terms of then retired populations. Is it good enough, not good enough? Not what I'm in the business of, but is it better than what existed in the early years post-ERISA and pre-ERISA? The numbers in that sense speak for themselves. The percentage of income, of all income of those over age 65, same type of line, started at 14, topped at 21, now at 20 basically. Again, flat line, and over time likely to go down a bit, but even that will take literally decades. Why? Because there's still, according to PBGC on the private side, 41 million people with some benefit somewhere that they're going to get out of a defined benefit plan. And there are still employers hiring millennials that still have open defined benefit plans, which gives it an even longer tail. So it will still be there in some form for a long time. And this one, you don't even have to read it, but it's just to make one point. When people say the average account balance is, what does it mean? When they do that number, they include all the zeros. They include all the people that came to work within the last month and signed up for the plan and haven't yet made their first contribution, but they're in the average. Does it matter? Is it significant? What this shows you against multiple segments of our database, and all of this in volume is on our website, is you've got to ask the question of what are you adding together? How old are the people? How long have the people been at one employer? My case, I've been at Ebury 35 years plus. I've been in a defined contribution plan at Ebury for 34 years. I've contributed the maximum amount by law. Ebury has contributed the maximum amount by law. All within the legal limits. All invested conservatively because my wife doesn't believe in equities. And I know enough to believe in what my wife believes in. I learned that from my father. And so we've only been married 40 years, but I'm targeting 69 to 70 or longer. Is essentially, even with all that, my 401k account balance is $2.4 million. With conservative investments, just purely contributing what the law allowed. So and why shouldn't you believe the 100,000? Because I'm in that too. So you got all the zeros throwing it off, you got people like me throwing it off. Isn't it more relevant to say, well, you know, you're an old fogey, you're just short of 65, but we'll stick there. And how long you been doing this, and how much do you have? And okay, fine, I bring that one up too. But for that population group, the 60 to 64, relative to 100,000, they're not doing too bad. And this is not inclusive of individual retirement accounts. This is. So that's one of the other things our data does that none of these other databases are capable of doing, which is adding together when you take people who have multiple employer defined contribution accounts, have IRAs 2 or 3 places, you add them all together, how does it end up coming out differently? How big would they have to be in order to match the defined benefit annuity payments people are getting today, taken at different percentiles? And overall, the system on those percentile bases is about equal between DB and DC. If we look at balances for the 60 to 65, just those balances, you add in IRAs for those same people, you compare, take the 735, compare it to the 445, it just underlines that for the longest tenure people, even the 20 to 30 years, the numbers indicate something different than we want one number. And this isn't to say there aren't lots of people hurting, there are, no question. But it is to put into perspective and allow people to think about it. We run our models one other way, which is we do factor them in. What if Social Security doesn't get cut? What if Social Security does get cut? And those numbers are there, and obviously in terms of implications rolling forward, depending on income quartile, it makes a big difference. And a lot of the things you'll get from enterprises don't make these adjustments, or don't present it both ways, or just present it with the cut. It's another set of questions to ask. So, is there a retirement crisis? Well, it's interesting. Not for the nation, not if, or if you deem it to be one today, then our numbers would indicate there's always been one. So which way do you want to think about it? There's always been a savings and income and cash shortfalls. We've looked at data back before World War II. It's essentially the reason that Social Security came in. We've been reading this week about the 50th anniversary of the Great Society. It's why Medicare and Medicaid came in. Universal mandatory systems like Social Security, wherever you look in the world or you look in the United States, if the objective is a given amount of income on a redistributional basis, on a mandatory basis, at the lowest possible administrative cost, every study from any place in the country and the world is going to say that centralized system. So with that set of objectives, apply it to the United States, that is what Social Security is about. World experience on annuity-based programs are the most cost-effective. If everybody was in an annuity pool, the total amount of money that needed to be saved would be 34% less than if we all save ourselves. Why? Because there are people like my brother that die young in a pool, balanced by people like my dad who die old in a pool. And it does make a significant difference. And it's also one other footnote that I've started reading in some analyses, but it's a relatively new thing that gets written into them. We've been trying to make the point for 35 years, so it's good to see them beginning to get written in, which is lump sum distributions are the rule, not the exception, out of private defined benefit pension plans. According to PBGC, 42% of the plans they insure in the defined benefit space are now cash balance plans that primarily pay single sum distributions. And in traditional defined benefit plans where there's no restriction that says you have to take part of the money as an annuity, about 35% take an annuity, the balance takes single sum distributions. So it's just a final point on this issue of digging down, is making sure that when you're writing stories and talking to people that the characterizations, end quotes, fit. Frequently it gets written about as defined benefit versus defined contribution. The reality is really, to any degree, it's an annuity versus a single sum. It's a pooled versus non-pooled. And the normal characterizations, just like now ERISA says they're both pensions, they both now frequently are just two different funding mechanisms to fund a single sum lump sum distribution. And that makes them more the same than different from a retirement income adequacy and policy perspective. So the system's changing. It's changing a lot. It's stronger against the metrics than it used to be, given that it's a voluntary system. If one has different objectives, one can test different objectives. We frequently do special model runs for journalists trying to run a particular type of story. And if we can ever do that for you, just let us know. We're happy to run your assumptions and give you a range of numbers, not a single number, a range of numbers on why it might be there. Thanks for having me.
Congratulations, you managed to use every single minute. Does anybody have one question? Anybody before we?
I wanted to ask, when did they go to the 5-year vesting? What year was that?
The 5-year was 1986. The 10-year was 1974.
Do you think that that's contributed to the underfunding when you go to the 5 years with some of these plans that are underfunded?
Not really, not the underfunding, because basically if you look at the market cycles, is almost all today's unfunded plans were very well funded in the interim. They tend to go funded, unfunded on a fairly regular cycle based on interest rates and based on market performance. And the biggest detriment to funding in the last many years has been low interest rates.
All right, we're going to wrap this up. You have received from us over the years certificates of appreciation, NPF mugs. This year you get the Evelyn Y. Davis Studios mug.
Such a deal
Such a deal.
for the new one.
And we hope to have you in the studio when we get it open.
Good.
So we'll have a lot to talk about. Thank you so much.
You all have my email address, you all have phone number, you all have the web. Happy to talk to you, and as my team is anytime.
And I
Thank
agree.
you.
Thank you.